There's a particular kind of childhood that leaves no visible marks, no dramatic scenes, no obvious cruelty, no single event you could point to in a therapist's office and say, there, that is where it happened. Instead, there's a slow, quiet accumulation of a single lesson. And the lesson is this: the most loving thing you can do for the people around you is to need as little as possible. You learned this lesson so early and so completely that you cannot remember learning it. It simply became the water you swam in, the air in the rooms you grew up in, the unspoken contract of your family system. You were not the difficult one. You were not the one who slammed doors or failed classes or brought chaos into the house. You were the other one, the one the adults exhaled around, the one who picked up on the tension in a room and, instead of adding to it, silently absorbed it. The one who cleaned their plate, kept their grades up, managed their own heartbreaks behind a closed door, and never, never let anyone see the bill coming due. They called you easy. They called you mature. They called you, sometimes, a blessing. And you learned to call it that too. But here is the question that I want to sit with you in today, the one that you have perhaps never let yourself fully ask. Who was taking care of you? Not in the practical sense. You were fed, you were sheltered, you were probably told you were loved. I'm asking something more specific than that. I'm asking, while you were busy holding yourself together so that no one else had to, who was paying attention to the child who was doing all that holding? Who was watching you? Who was asking, with genuine curiosity, what was going on inside? If the answer that surfaces is a long silence, then this video was made for you. Here is what I want to show you today. That child, the easy one, the ghost, the one who made themselves invisible so that the household could breathe, that child did not disappear. They grew up. They are sitting somewhere right now watching this video, living in an adult life that by most external measures looks perfectly functional, and they are exhausted in a way they cannot fully explain. Not tired, exhausted, the specific depletion that comes from spending years being reliably present for every person in your life while being quietly, consistently absent to yourself. Today, we are going to trace that exhaustion to its root. We are going to name with real precision what happened in that childhood, what the easy child pattern actually costs, not just emotionally, but neurologically, relationally, in the architecture of the self. And then we are going to talk about something that most conversations about this pattern never quite reach: the grief. Because becoming visible after a lifetime of practiced invisibility is not simply a liberation, it is a mourning. And until you are willing to mourn what the erasure cost you, the liberation will keep slipping through your fingers. Stay with me. We have a story in our culture about selfless children, and the story is flattering. The selfless child is the good one, the one who figured it out early, the one who had enough maturity, enough grace, enough love to set aside their own needs for the greater good of the family. I want to be careful here because I know that story is precious to some of you. It is the story that made the erasure bearable. If you chose it, if it was an act of generosity rather than an act of survival, then it carries dignity, and I don't want to take that from you. But I want to offer you a more precise version, and the more precise version requires us to look without flinching at the actual environment in which that selflessness was born. Because extreme selflessness in a child does not emerge in a vacuum. It emerges in response to a specific set of environmental conditions. It emerges when a child looks at the emotional landscape of their family and performs, at an age when they should not be capable of this level of social calculation, but somehow remarkably are, a real-time cost-benefit analysis. And the calculation goes something like this. There is a finite amount of emotional space in this house. The adults are using most of it. My sibling is using some of it. There is not enough left for what I'm carrying. And since I cannot make more space, the only rational option is to make myself smaller. This is not maturity. I want to say that clearly, because you've been told it was maturity your entire life, and that story has done you real damage. This is triage. A child performing triage on their own emotional needs, deciding which parts of themselves are worth taking up space with and which parts need to be quietly shelved, is not demonstrating strength. They are demonstrating that their environment has asked something of them that their environment had no right to ask. You did not become easy because you were easy. You became easy because the cost of being difficult was one you could see your family could not afford. And so with a love that was genuine and a sacrifice that was real, you paid the bill yourself. You have been paying it ever since. Let me show you what that early triage does to a developing nervous system, because this is not metaphor. This is the specific, traceable way that the easy child pattern rewires the brain's relationship to the self. There is a concept in psychology called pathological self-sufficiency. The name sounds clinical, and the experience of it is anything but the precision of the language is useful, so let's stay with it. Pathological self-sufficiency develops when a child is praised consistently and reliably for having no needs, not punished for having no needs, praised for not having them, and this distinction is everything. Punishment creates avoidance. You learn to hide the behavior that gets punished. But praise shapes identity. When being easy, being low maintenance, being the one who has it together earns you love and relief and the specific warmth of being told you are a blessing, your nervous system doesn't just learn a behavior, it builds a self around the behavior. Being self-sufficient stops being something you do, it becomes something you are. And this is where the trap closes. Because once it is part of your identity, once I am the person who doesn't need things is structural to how you understand yourself, asking for help stops feeling like a simple request. It starts feeling like a betrayal, a collapse of the self you have built, an admission that the person everyone has been relying on is in fact unreliable. To you, having a need does not feel like a normal human experience. It feels like evidence of failure. And so you do not express your needs, not because no one would help. Sometimes the people around you are genuinely willing and able, but because the act of asking requires you to be a kind of person you have spent decades learning not to be. There is a specific loneliness that lives inside this pattern. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being deeply known as competent, deeply known as reliable, deeply known as the person who handles things, and utterly unknown as the person who sometimes cannot. You have been so good at your disappearing act that the people who love you most have, in some ways, never actually met you. And underneath the exhaustion, underneath the low-grade resentment that we will talk about in a moment, underneath it all, is a question so quiet it is almost inaudible. Who is actually seeing me, or do they just see what I'm willing to show? I want to talk about your resentment, not the resentment you admit to, the one you've examined, journaled about, maybe discussed in therapy. I want to talk about the other one, the one that surfaces briefly and then gets swallowed so quickly that you almost doubt it was there. It surfaces when you have spent 3 hours listening to a friend's crisis and they hang up without asking how you are. It surfaces when you have quietly managed something difficult, at work, at home, inside your own chest, and nobody noticed because you managed it so cleanly there was nothing to notice. It surfaces when someone who has been leaning on you for years describes you to a mutual acquaintance as the most stable person I know. And instead of feeling proud, you feel, for one unguarded second, furious. This resentment is not a character flaw. It is information. It is your nervous system, finally, after years of patience, sending you a message that it can no longer encode politely. I have been erased for too long. But here is the thing. And this is the part that requires real honesty to look at directly. You have not been erased by the people around you, or not only by them. You have been, in the most significant and most repairable way, erasing yourself. Think about it with precision. Think about the last 10 times someone asked how you were. How many times did you answer truthfully? How many times did the word fine come out before you had even checked internally whether fine was accurate? How many times did someone offer you help and you deflected it? Not because you didn't need it, but because accepting it would require you to be the kind of person who accepts help. You have spent years methodically teaching the world that you do not need anything, and now you are furious that the world believes you. This is not irony. This is the logical conclusion of a pattern that was never sustainable. The easy child became the easy adult, and the easy adult built a life that functions beautifully on the outside and runs on the inside on a fuel source that was always finite. And now the gauge is low, and nobody knows because you haven't told them, because telling them would require you to be difficult. Do you feel right now what I mean when I say you are trapped in a prison of your own making? Not a prison built by the people who failed to see you, a prison built from the very skills that kept you safe. Skills that are so refined, so automatic, so fluent that they operate continuously even when you are trying to stop them. That is the thing about survival strategies. They don't ask permission before they activate. Here is the insight that I want you to really sit inside rather than simply collect. By becoming the child no one had to worry about, you solved for belonging. You kept yourself in the room. You made yourself necessary and low cost, and therefore, as you understood it, safe. But you also, and this is the wound beneath the wound, you also made yourself unlovable in the specific way that love actually works. Because love, real love, requires a target. It requires a self that is specific enough, present enough, visible enough to be held. You cannot love a ghost. You can appreciate a ghost, you can rely on a ghost, you can even feel warmly toward a ghost, but you cannot love it. Not in the way that reaches through and touches something and changes both people in the exchange. And you have been a ghost, a warm, competent, deeply caring ghost, but ghost nonetheless. Think about the people in your life who feel most truly loved, not most appreciated, not most depended upon, most loved. I suspect that those people are not the easiest ones in the room. They're the ones who let themselves be known, who express preferences and needs and disappointments, who are occasionally inconvenient. Their inconvenience is not a bug. It is the mechanism by which love finds a surface to land on. When you make yourself perfectly frictionless, when you have no edges, no needs, no moments of genuine difficulty, you are not making yourself easier to love. You are making yourself harder because there is nothing to push against, nothing to navigate, nothing to be needed for except the function you're performing. You have mistaken self-erasure for lovability, and it has cost you, quietly, over years, in a way you are only now beginning to calculate, the very thing you erased yourself to protect. The belonging you were optimizing for requires you to actually be there. So, how do you stop disappearing when disappearing has been your most reliable tool for decades? Slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of tolerance for the discomfort that comes when your nervous system insists, loudly and convincingly, that visibility is dangerous. The first practice I want to give you is what I call the small inconvenience. Today, ask for something small. Ask a friend to pick something up for you. Ask your partner to handle something you would normally handle. Ask your colleague to take something off your plate. The content of the request almost doesn't matter. What matters is the practice of inhabiting the body of a person who has needs and expresses them, and then staying in the room while the discomfort of having done so moves through you. That discomfort is not a signal that you did something wrong. It is the feeling of your identity updating. The second practice is the honest answer. The next time someone asks how you are, and you are not, in fact, fine, try this. Don't answer immediately. Take 2 seconds, check, and then say something true. Not a revelation, not a crisis disclosure, not a request for rescue, just something true. I've been carrying a lot this week. Honestly, I'm a bit depleted. I'm okay, but it's been harder than usual. Watch what happens. Watch how the person responds. Discover, experimentally, whether the world actually ends when you tell the truth about your experience. I suspect you will find that it does not. The third practice, and this one requires the most honesty, is the resentment audit. Take a quiet moment and ask yourself, where in my life am I currently feeling resentment that I have not expressed? Not to perform the resentment at someone, but to simply acknowledge it to yourself as information. Resentment, in the easy child, is almost always a map. It points directly at the places where you have been invisible longest, where you have been giving without receiving, where the ghost has been working hardest. Follow the resentment. It will show you exactly where you need to become more real. I want to name something before we close, because I think it is important, and I think most content about this pattern skips past it in the rush to get to the hope. Becoming visible is going to involve grief. Not just relief, not just liberation, grief. Because when you finally begin to let yourself be seen, when you start telling the truth about how you are, asking for what you need, taking up the space that was always yours to take, you will inevitably have to reckon with how long you went without doing it. How many years, how many relationships lived at half depth because you were only ever half present? How much of your own life you experienced from the outside? That grief is real, and it deserves to be honored, not indulged, not used as a reason to delay the work, but honored, witnessed, given a few quiet moments before you move forward. Because you were a child, you were doing the best you could with what you understood. The erasure was not your failure, it was your adaptation. And adaptations, even the ones that cost us, deserve to be laid down gently rather than simply discarded. Here is what I want to leave you with. The people who truly belong in your life, the ones worth the vulnerability of becoming visible for, they do not need you to be easy. They have never needed that. What they have needed, and what they have perhaps been waiting for longer than you know, is for you to show up. Not the managed version, not the performing version, not the ghost who keeps everything running smoothly and asks for nothing in return. You, with needs and edges and the occasional inconvenient truth, with a specific hunger for specific things, with a voice that says what is actually true instead of what keeps the peace. You spent your childhood making sure the room was comfortable for everyone else. The room has been waiting all this time for you to take your seat in it. Sit down. You belong here.